Hey everyone, welcome to Zonan Canada. I'm your host, Jesse Betteridge. Joining me in this episode is my good friend and convention goer and convention panelist, Amanda Oldring, who was one of my convention buddies at Anime Revolution 2017 just a couple of weeks ago. Amanda, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me, Jesse. Hey, everybody.
So we are talking about Anime Revolution 2017 on this episode. We are actually going to be devoting pretty much the whole episode to talking about this one convention, which is not something we typically do. If you're not familiar with Anime Revolution, which is usually abbreviated as AniRevo for a variety of strange reasons, it is for the most part, the major anime convention that takes place in Vancouver every year. And I don't know how you felt, Amanda. I thought it was okay. It was an okay convention. It had ups and downs, kind of mediocre overall.
I think that that your experience would definitely depend on your reasons for being there, and there's a lot of different reasons why people come to AniRevo. I mean, I've been an anime fan since I was a kid, and I've been watching anime for longer than I care to admit now. And that's really driven me when I go to conventions and I participate in conventions to come from a panelist perspective rather than maybe a cosplayer's perspective or a vendor's perspective. So, I had a great time and I had a positive time, but I think that, overall, I'd say that there was room for growth, but that it is a growing con. So that's kind of what we can expect.
So, it depends how you're coming at it. I think, most people, a lot of people got more than they wanted. Some maybe not so much. I think that the overall result was just kind of average for the most part. And again, I think we experienced the convention a little differently from, people who might focus on cosplay or singing performances, strangely, which is an oddly prominent thing at Anime Revolution, which we'll get into later.
Yeah.
But overall, it's just the end result is an okayish, sort of mediocre con. You would think that a con that is simply okay from a variety of different angles wouldn't offer much to talk about, but that is completely untrue when it comes to Anime Revolution. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to this convention.
I agree with you completely.
Oh, so much. And I feel like, we've talked about Anime Revolution a bit on the show before. And I think I kind of touched on a few things vaguely, but we've never really gotten in depth with it. And I think that it is something that demands exploration. I think that AniRevo embodies a lot of the problems we see with a lot of cons in Canada, or a lot of the situations we see with cons in Canada. And a lot of it has to do with Vancouver as a market. If you haven't really followed the kind of convention scene in Vancouver, it is kind of chaotic, and I think there's a lot of debates about why that is. I have my own theories. So Vancouver is, I feel, one of the most fertile markets for anime outside of Asia, yet...
Yeah, it's kind of a Wild West in some ways, hey?
In a lot of ways. I think it is, and I think that despite that, it is constantly and consistently neglected by the industry. You could say the same about most conventions in Canada, but I think it's especially true about Vancouver and its events and its kind of anime culture.
Yeah, which is kind of ironic in a way when you consider Vancouver's existence as sort of a hub in media production.
Exactly.
In North America.
Yeah, you have such a... It's such a entertainment media focused kind of city, and it also has the highest percentage of East Asian population in North America when you look at it per capita. I think the last figure that I saw was Vancouver's 42%. Vancouver's population is 42% East Asian, but that is just when you look at the city of Vancouver. That number is even higher when you count the entire Metro Vancouver area, including Richmond. The city of Richmond, which is one of the suburbs of Vancouver, if you're not familiar with the geography around here. These things kind of combined should make Vancouver, despite having a smaller population than a lot of other cities around North America, a real kind of destination for anime, and yet it never seems to get that attention that it deserves.
Momentum. Yeah, and I agree with you.
It doesn't get a lot of attention from outside of the city, and for some reason the infrastructures within the city fail to keep the momentum needed going a lot of the time. There's been a lot of cons that have come and gone in Vancouver. Anime Revolution has probably done the best job of keeping that momentum going, not only of conventions, but I think of a lot of different organizations and companies in the city. But there's still this sort of consistent kind of failure to really tap into the potential. I think there's, like I said, it's very fertile. Nothing can really seem to get.
And it's interesting, Jesse. I reflect on that a fair bit, and it seems almost in some ways that Vancouver is trying to find an identity. Maybe there's a bit of a crisis of identity here. We've had so many different cons that have kind of sprung up over the years and haven't really grown, or they've gone in different directions, and there seems to be this sense of trying to figure out who are we in relation to SakuraCon, our neighbor just in Seattle. How are we different? What can Canada celebrate, and what can Canada do to attract Canadian anime fans and Japanese cultural fans that other conventions aren't already doing?
Yeah. And not just Canadian fans. A key is getting people from like across the continent to come, and that's tricky when we're so close to the border, because why come to a con in Canada when you can go to, if you live in the United States, when you can go to SakuraCon, which is pretty much the best anime convention anywhere even close to this area, and the whole sort of Cascadian Pacific Northwest kind of area.
Exactly, and I think that's part of the reason why Anime Revolution and related cons, but Anime Revolution especially, still hasn't quite managed to shrug off that sort of grassroots feel about it. It's still sort of in this identification phase in some ways.
Well, I would actually kind of argue that they have little incentive to break out of it a lot of the time. I think some of it has to do with their nature as a for-profit con. Some of it has to do with the fact that, you just kind of can't compete with a convention like SakuraCon so close. So, the incentive just isn't there a lot of the time. But the thing I think a lot of the problems with cons in Vancouver are reflective of Vancouver as a city itself. It's a very young city, and again, that kind of taps into what you brought up about the identity crisis and trying to find a voice for the culture here. And it's also a city that's like rapidly, it has rapid problems of growth and unaffordability and gaps in poverty and wages, and it's a city where you can't really find a good middle ground a lot of the time, and all these things just kind of collide in a way that that makes Vancouver lack an identity to an extent, which is unfortunate. And that I feel that Anime Revolution reflects the city as a whole in a lot of ways. In many ways, it is a convention that is befitting the city of Vancouver.
Yeah, I like that idea. In some ways, some things were done really well, and some things, really could have been changed, or maybe need to go a little bit differently. I really got the sense that Anime Revolution is very much a convention in motion. It's still a convention that's really finding its legs, and in some ways, that's one of the things that I really quite enjoy about it is watching this growth process. And it's got a very young energy. It's got a very excited energy. And I think that there's a lot of potential there to develop it further.
Yeah. It is a 6th-year convention, which on one hand is kind of the point where you would expect a convention to have been becoming a little more fully formed. At the same time, it seems like a very young convention for a city as large and prominent as Vancouver. And I think if you live in Vancouver, you probably know why Anime Revolution is such a young convention. And there is actually, I guess we should probably go a little bit into the background of this. Amanda, how long have you been going to the various conventions in Vancouver? I'm just curious. I can't remember how far back you go with this stuff.
Yeah, so I've been going to conventions since 2011, but I've only been going to Anime Revolution for about 3 years. I think the first time I went was in 2012.
Okay,
and then
so you don't go back too far.
Not too far.
Relatively,
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then again in the last 3 I've been attending. So yeah, my experience is probably a little bit different from someone like you, Jesse, who has really got to see it kind of grow from the ground up.
Sort of. The very first anime convention in in Vancouver was called AkaCon. That took place, I think, around 2000, 2001. And I don't know too much about it because nobody who went there really likes to talk about it too much. Apparently it was held at a hotel, and they burned a lot of bridges with hotels in downtown Vancouver, which made it very difficult for any convention to find hotel space for many years, which is why, again, for many years it was hard for anime cons to find a good venue because the convention center space, which Anime Revolution does use, and I think that venue was a big part of their success, it's just too expensive for most cons who are starting out. And that's relegated a lot of the conventions we had to just either cheap or university campuses, for their venues, which, I think turned a lot of people off and wasn't really befitting of people's expectations for a convention in Vancouver. People's expectations, I think, play a lot into the scene we have there, and people have very different expectations from what I found. AkaCon, it kind of got things off to a bad start, but their Anime Evolutions, which was not only the anime convention in Vancouver, but pretty much the convention in Vancouver for many years. There really weren't a lot of events going on throughout the aughts when Anime Evolution was going on, which was kind of strange. Even Fan Expo Vancouver didn't start until about a year after Anime Evolution ended. Anime Evolution actually started out as Anime Showcase, which was run by the Vancouver Japanese Anime Society, VJAS, as well as what used to be the Anime Club at SFU, which was the ARC. And it was just like a screening night at the downtown campus at SFU. And they would just screen anime, and it sort of turned into a convention, which they ran as Anime Evolution in 2003. At that point, it was run by Anime Evolution Corp, and it ran from 2003 to 2010. And it was a small convention. It never surpassed 6,000 attendees. But it was popular. People loved it. People had a good time at the convention, even though it always was, except for 1 year, it was always isolated to university campuses as a venue, which kept it small. They did bring in Japanese bands, but throughout their entire 9-year history, they never once succeeded in bringing in an industry or voice actor guest from Japan, which was honestly probably one of the biggest black marks on the con, was that they could never do that, because being able to get guests like that is one of the big advantages of running a convention on the West Coast. If anything, the prevailing mentality is that East Coast cons have great fan panelist content. West Coast cons don't, but they make up for it with amazing guests. And Anime Evolution never really managed to do that. They did manage to get into the Vancouver Convention Center 1 year, which was their second last year, which is, I'm still kind of amazed by how that whole thing played out, because usually when conventions move to a new venue, they gain attendees. It's a sign of growth,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somehow Anime Evolution lost attendees when they moved to the Vancouver Convention Center. I don't know if it was because it shifted from August to June and that really threw people off for that 1 year, but it was kind of this kind of shocking moment that they clearly lost a lot of money in the process of when that happened. And I think it
was it just a case of growing too fast too soon, do you think? Did you get the sense
I
that
never felt that
maybe they were anticipating a bigger turnout than they budgeted for?
You know what? I can't really speak to that. I'm not really sure. I don't think that they ever really grew that much, especially in comparison to a lot of other anime conventions. I mean, just for perspective, a mid-sized convention is usually considered to be about 15,000 people. And I know we had a little debate about this earlier with Anime Revolution. I think they definitely surpassed 10,000 a few years ago. I currently pin them a little closer to 15,000. I think you estimated the turnout's a little less than that at this point.
Yeah,
but
I did.
In any case, Anime Revolution is somewhere around the mid-sized convention, which is much bigger than Anime Evolution or any other anime-related event managed to get in Vancouver.
It's too bad they don't release their numbers. We could have had a bet going.
Yeah, that's the thing. No, none of the conventions in Vancouver ever seem to release their numbers. In the case of Anime, sorry?
That's a little uncommon, isn't it?
But I mean, most conventions around the continent release their numbers. For some reason, Anime Revolution doesn't. But in my opinion, I think it's because they're always trying to appear a little larger than they actually are. But they are, they're a mid-sized convention, which the early conventions here never really never seem to manage to do. But yeah, for whatever reason, Anime Evolution's move to the larger convention center didn't work out, and then they wound up at UBC for their final year. And then, technically Anime Evolution, as run by Anime Evolution Corp., is a defunct event. I still won't get into too much detail about things that happened with that convention. The event had to end rather abruptly in 2010. And when that happened, it seemed that, a dozen different groups just kind of rushed in to try to create their own events to fill the void. And I am somewhat guilty of that as well, because I am one of the lead organizers behind one of those events that sprung up shortly after that happened. But that's when we started to see more events popping up in Vancouver, and that's when Anime Revolution popped up just a year later in 2012.
Yeah, that's great. I'm pretty sure I went the first year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was, it had kind of a shady start. People weren't really sure who they are. They're not, like, the people who run the convention are not people who are part of the quote-unquote anime community in Vancouver, which is an entity that I argue doesn't really exist. I think it's more of a loose general culture in this city, because it's just, there's so much, the amount of casual interest in anime is so high. I think it's ridiculous to try and pin it down to a specific community.
Pretty reasonable.
Yeah, and the first year of AR, it felt like an event run by people who had never even been to an anime convention before, but right from the beginning, they managed to do certain key things correctly and very, very well. They secured Canada Place, which is the East Wing of the Vancouver Convention Center, as their venue, which is, for all the problems that building has, it was a much better venue than basically anything else that any other competing event had tried, at least for that style of event. They managed to bring in a Japanese voice actor guest, the first event in Vancouver that managed to do that. And they put a lot of emphasis on stage performances. The people who run their programming put a lot of emphasis on that, and, even though it's not really my thing, and I'm not sure if it's really your thing either, they tend to be very popular with attendees. And they also, even though this is an area that the con was lacking in this year, they do bring in industry as well. They generally manage to bring in Aniplex and Crunchyroll, sometimes Funimation, which you don't see enough of in Canadian cons in general. And cosplay guests seem to be a really big deal. They brought in people like Jessica Nigri for the first couple of years, and this year they brought in I think 4 cosplay guests from different Asian countries. I know Stay and Mon were 2 really big ones that I heard people talking about all the time. I don't follow that stuff at all, so I can't even begin to pretend to know what I'm talking about when I bring that up. But that's a huge deal for a lot of the attendees here.
I'm on the same page with you, Jesse, and I think that the increase in cosplay guests that we're seeing in conventions like Anime Revolution is definitely a sign of the times, that the audience demographic and interest in anime is changing and shifting over time, to really take a sort of a different focus, or just a changing focus in terms of what people are finding attractive about conventions and what's drawing them there.
Yeah, and I mean, bringing in cosplay guests from, flying them in from different countries, I think is very significant, because it shows how it almost kind of it brings a sort of legitimization to something that is normally seen as like a grassroots fandom culture kind of thing.
DIY kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Anyway, they, even for all the very weird and wonky problems that con had for its first couple of years, from the very beginning, they nailed those key things down. And in terms of getting Japanese voice actor guests, that's something they put very prominent focus on from the beginning. And from what I hear, their guest relations are top notch as well. So for all the things that they kind of are not so great with or cut back on, they go into the right places, and those are those things that keep that kind of keep the convention running. And they're the only convention that has managed to nail down those key things, and that has helped them achieve a sort of momentum in terms of turnout that we have not seen from another event, and we're probably not going to see from another event, at least none of the other ones that are going right now. I know a lot of people. Okay, well, let me point out that Anime Evolution 2010 was not the end of Anime Evolution. There is another organization called the Vancouver Anime Convention Society that brought Anime Evolution back from the dead the year after Anime Revolution launched, and it's kind of still going to this day, but not really. A lot of its followers are people who are like devoted to it, kind of latch on to every mistake that Anime Revolution makes. And honestly, I find there's a lot of slander that goes on in certain circles, especially against Anime Revolution, that is not necessarily warranted a lot of the time.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head here, and it recalls to mind some of the criticism I've heard about Vancouver as a city in general, and it seems like maybe it's trickling into the convention scene as well, is that there is a marked lack of cohesive community in this city. And when you get that kind of fragmented approach to being in Vancouver or to being a fan, you've got this sense, there's not really that same sense of camaraderie here. It's not about like, here's our city's convention, let's make it bigger, let's make it better. It's everybody has their idea of what they want to do, or certain groups have their ideas of what they want to do, and they're taking that and running with that and failing to see how that is disadvantaging them.
Do I sound really futile when I say that I don't feel that I think it's useless to try and define the anime scene in Vancouver as a community and think of it more as just a broader culture? Because I think it just makes more sense, but...
But when it comes to event organizing, I think there's a certain amount of solidarity that is missing.
I can get behind that idea. And to be honest, like when you look at a city like Seattle, I'm not really familiar with whatever drama they have in that city. All I know is that SakuraCon is a stable, well-run convention. I go there, I enjoy the city, I go to the public market, I eat at Ludi's, used to eat at Rock Bottom before they shut that place down. Wasn't happy with that development.
That's a sad time.
Yeah. But you fold it in with that whole trip to Seattle, you get the veneer of going to a new place, and you don't really think about whatever drama is actually going on in that city. I don't know if it's comparable to what goes on in Vancouver, but I feel that there is something sort of unique about the way things play out here, and you get a lot of salt in the air that kind of blows things out of proportion a lot of the time. I think when we're looking at this year's Anime Revolution, you kind of saw that really rear its head to a degree. And I don't want to defend the mistakes that Anime Revolution made, but this is the first year that they made a really, really big mistake. Okay, I should point out this. Normally they're in the East Convention of the convention center. This was their first year in the West building. The West building is fucking beautiful. I love that place. I think
that's a bit of an understatement.
Yeah, it is a magnificent place to run any kind of event. I hope that Anime Revolution continues to book this venue. I hope that they continue to expand the venue. If they could use the whole building and make that whole thing devoted to an anime convention, that would be amazing. It is a gorgeous place. And I thought for sure that the year that they moved over to that building, there was going to be some problem in the way that they used the venue. They were going to have some kind of colossal fuck up regarding that. They didn't. They actually, even though they only had a very small part of that building, and probably a little less than they could have used, they still used it really well, I found.
I think part of the excellence in terms of how we saw that space used, in addition to the planning, had to do with the staff and the volunteers and their organization. I was really quite impressed with the organization of the people that they did have. I don't feel that they had enough of them, but for the ones that they did have, it operated very, very smoothly with the space that they were using.
I think their staff for the most part is well trained. I don't think they're always well allocated, which is I will certainly be touching on that in a bit. They planned the space well, they used it well, but they really, really dropped the ball on one thing. If you followed this convention at all, you probably heard about this one colossal failure that they had on the first day of the event, which really overshadowed things for a lot of people, and I think wound up blowing other much more minor problems in the convention out of proportion. And that was what happened with the line, the pre-reg line on Friday. So what happened was early in the morning, the line to pick up pre-reg and the line to actually register for the convention was very short, and somebody who I am certain was a very inexperienced person who probably shouldn't have been allowed to make this call, yet did, thought it would be okay to merge the lines together into one line and then separate them later when the crowd started building. What apparently happened was the crowd builded much, much, much more quickly than they expected to. And I should note that, moving into the new part of the venue, this con did see quite a bit of growth this year, compared to its previous years in Canada Place. But nonetheless, most of the people lining up were pre-reg, and they should have realized that. The booth to actually get people registered they had far too few staff working in that area. I think they had the same number of people who usually do it every year, despite the fact that the con has seen significant growth over the last couple of years. And they let the pre-reg and reg lines just grow too large too quickly while merged together, to the point that it was no longer logistically feasible. Well, it was probably possible, but it would have been very, very difficult to split the line at that point.
It was a bottleneck.
Yeah, and so they kind of just let it stand. And throughout the entire day, they had one huge, massive pre-reg, reg line merged together, wrapping around the building. Obviously, this didn't affect us because we were panelists and we were able to just go right to the info booth and get our passes, as it should be, because if a panelist was stuck in that line, they wouldn't have been able to do their panel, and that would have been...
Have a convention.
Yeah. And also I should note that SakuraCon never let me do that, or any other convention never let me simply pick my panelist badge up at the info booth. So
I was 2.5 hours at SakuraCon to get in.
Yeah, I mean, at least the line control was better there for a significantly larger convention. But oh my God, this is a rookie mistake. Letting the line merge together at any point is not a mistake that a 6th-year convention should be making. I know 6 years is still pretty young as far as a lot of conventions go, but
then you decide.
This is like Convention Ops 101. You do not merge the registered and the registering and pre-registered lines together ever. That is bad, bad, bad. You don't do that. Yeah, it was stunning that they dropped the ball on that. And it created a lot of salt in the air. If you were following social media, people, especially those who like to dig into Anime Revolution, any chance they get, were just having a field day. Even I was kind of ripping the convention apart on Twitter throughout the day because the problem needed to be highlighted. Their solution was to keep pre-reg open until midnight. I mean, to be fair, I understand that splitting the reg and pre-reg lines apart was logistically difficult. Perhaps logistically difficult enough to not attempt to do it. I can see that. I was just aghast that not only would they make their volunteers work that late, or their staff and volunteers work that late to try and get all the pre-reg taken care of.
To bring the numbers down.
Yeah, but to not assign more staff to work behind that booth. And I know you mentioned that there weren't enough staff at the con. Maybe that's true, but they certainly should have made some kind of effort to reallocate some of the staff that was working that day. And they didn't do it. They still had, I think, at most half a dozen people handling this massive line of pre-registration. And it was a total disaster. Obviously, this was only an issue on Friday. Once you got your badge, and I noticed that once people got their badges, they didn't seem to really care anymore. They were in the convention, they were happy. And obviously the next day, this wasn't a problem. They had the line split again. And it is worth pointing out, again, showing that Anime Revolution has sort of hit that momentum where nothing's going to stop them at this point. It did not deter people from coming and buying a badge on Saturday.
But it be rather disappointing, especially when you're planning on doing a full 3 days at the convention. You spend half of your first day in the lineup ride.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Waiting for 3.5 to 4 hours to pick up your pre-reg badge, this is not an unusual experience at an anime convention. This actually happens all the time.
Oh, and it's probably short if you compare it to bigger conventions like PAX.
Yeah, exactly. And it is worth pointing out, if you hadn't heard, British Columbia has had serious problems with wildfires over the course of the
That's a bit
summer.
of an understatement. This is our wildfire season in recorded history.
Yeah, it just edged out the 1950s wildfires as the largest, the most widespread wildfire situation in BC history. And there was just see, one of the great things about the Vancouver Convention Center is the view is beautiful, and that was basically ruined the whole weekend because there was so much smoke covering the entire view. And of course, if you were standing outside, you were standing in the smoke. It wasn't quite as bad as a lot of people were making it out to be, and I think that, you know, the weather, that type of conditions is still nowhere near as bad as standing out in the heat in LA can be sometimes. But yeah, it was a pretty bad experience overall, but not an unusual experience to have at an anime convention. The problem with this 3.5 to 4 hour wait in unideal conditions was the circumstances in which it happened. It was preventable, and they just chose not to really plan well for it or do anything to address the problem properly. And that, this is the first time that they, the con really dropped the ball and got a lot of attention for dropping the ball on something. That was really bad. I was really disappointed that happened, and it even though I didn't have to wait in the line myself at any point, it still kind of dragged things down for me on the Friday.
Well, given that, your panel was early in the morning and probably 50% of a potential audience was still outside waiting to get in, I can certainly understand how that would affect you. It certainly affected other panelists, and I'm sure it affected the vendors market as well. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, there were still lots of people who in the convention, for sure, even on Friday. But yeah, that's just really bad planning, and I know a lot of people were saying that they hope this is the mistake that they hope killed AniRevo, and it won't be.
Not at all.
This is a 3-day event. After this first day was over, people completely forgot that this even happened and just moved on, as is so often the case.
And I think that there's a point, and maybe year 6 is the point when your snowball is big enough and has picked up enough momentum, has enough notoriety that to a certain extent it will continue to carry itself forward, despite these kinds of mishaps.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly, and that's why, regardless of what people think about Anime Revolution, if you want, to support an anime convention in Vancouver, you kind of just have to go with it at this point. I think it is imperative that people just, provide feedback, do everything they can to try and make the event better. And just because this is the event. This is the one that we have, and
this is the event.
Yeah. So, granted, I don't think that a situation like this is ever going to happen again, but still, you still had a situation where somebody who I'm sure was very inexperienced and should not have made a call, merging those lines together, was still able to. So there's a lot of improvement that has to happen in their ops, for certain.
And we've talked about this earlier in the podcast as well, right? It is a growing con. It's getting its legs. It's at the point now where it's really starting to get a sense of self, a sense of voice. It's in the biggest possible venue that it can be in Vancouver, the nicest possible venue. It was their first year there. The logistics obviously weren't going to be perfect. That I have every confidence that next year is going to be so much more improved on the hiccups that we saw this year.
Yeah, I'm sure there was a convergence of a lot of unfortunate things happening over the course of the weekend. And you heard people. There were a lot of complaints about other things. Most of the other problems at the convention I found were pretty typical for Anime Revolution. In terms of what I was talking about with staff allocation, another thing that is probably worth noting is the fact that they introduced these UV stamps at the con this year.
Yes, we have to talk about the UV stamp.
So, and I should point out, right now we're dwelling on the two big issues that people complained about incessantly with with Anime Revolution. So maybe we'll try to get through this quicker and focus on, I think, more of the important details with the meat of the con itself. But I mean, we have to talk about this UV thing. So Anime Revolution every year, unlike most anime conventions, which which are usually content to just simply print out badges with your name pre-written on it and use that for your personal identification. Anime Revolution has always insisted on using these big plastic badges. I think the reason that they use the big plastic badges, which is because they look fancier and they feel probably raise the profile of the event. But the actual functional utilitarian purpose of those large plastic badges is that they are supposed to be tradable. They are exchangeable. And Anime Revolution tried to crack down on that this year. And you know what? I don't blame them for trying to crack down on badge ghosting, which is where people just kind of get in and out of the convention by trading badges with each other. That's a problem in most cities with most conventions. I think it is especially a big problem in Vancouver because we have had so many years of just venues that don't really secure an area very well for convention goers, that people just kind of feel entitled to be able to go to an event for free. And I don't blame them for trying to crack down on this. But what they did was, because they are so insistent on sticking with these big plastic badges, that they actually had this customized UV stamp that they put on people's hands, and they would actually use a UV light to scan your hands when you're going into certain areas.
Yeah, and in principle, I like the idea of using a UV stamp over like an ink stamp, especially if you're going in as a cosplayer and you don't necessarily want this big marked thing that you're going to need to photo edit out later, which, as we know, is increasingly a larger part of the convention demographic, is cosplayers. So the UV idea, great in theory, but terrible in practice if you're not putting it in the same spot for every single person.
And they weren't. I would constantly have to like shuffle my arm around to show them where the stamp actually was versus where they expected it to be, which was everywhere except where it was on my arm.
Yeah, if they're going to play that kind of game, stamp the badges.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Why do you use the plastic exchangeable badges when the functional purpose of those badges is to be able to exchange them and trade them and transfer them to other people? You can't use those badges and create an expectation of sort of tradability and then undermine that with something like the UV stamp. And it just blows my mind, especially when using printed out paper passes like virtually every other anime convention does is probably significantly cheaper than what they opted to do here. And another thing. Not
only that. Go ahead. Sorry, Jesse. I have a couple of comments on this, but I'll wait until you're done.
Yeah. So, and also the plastic, what they did to individually identify people on these plastic badges, unless you had a signature, $200 signature badge, which I am still amazed by how many people buy those. They would actually just write your first name and first initial on the back of the badge in permanent marker. And I'm not gonna explicitly say how you could get around all of this at the convention and still trade badges. But I will point out that rubbing alcohol takes permanent marker right off cleanly and clearly.
Well, that's exactly right. We did. Jesse and I did a test with this after the con just to see. We had this talk and we thought, this seems like a bit of a security loophole. If you're writing with permanent marker on a piece of plastic, it's an easy material to remove. So I went home and I got a piece of rubbing alcohol after the con, of course, and just rubbed my name off just to demonstrate how simple this is. So the addition of applying a UV stamp and the extra cost and the extra time and also the extra line weights that it created to try and find everybody's stamps while you're looking at them seems like a very unnecessary cost, especially considering, again, that yes, plastic is much more expensive than paper. It's also much less eco-friendly than paper, which is surprising.
Yes, that too.
Vancouver is supposed to be the greenest city in the world.
I know, right?
If you're going to go paperless, fabulous idea. Get a mobile app or get people to return their badges at the end of the con.
Yeah. But yeah, maybe that's the angle we should use. Like, Vancouver's the green city. Why is our Vancouver's anime convention doing like the ungreenest thing possible in terms of convention security? And the other thing is that the bottlenecks within the con caused by the UV stamp honestly were not as bad as I expected. You could get to most areas pretty easily. There were times when a lineup formed outside of the dealer's hall due to the due to them checking the UV stamp on every person who came in, but they usually just kind of gave up after a while and just went with the badges instead. Again, it did get a little bad a couple times, but never anywhere near the disaster that it could have been, and I at times expected it to be.
Yeah.
So
it's a lovely idea in theory. In practice, the materials that they're using have left some fairly substantial security holes that their system isn't going to solve.
Yeah.
So maybe you could rethink that a little bit more.
Yeah. But here's the thing that bothered me the most about this. It's that they had at every checkpoint, they usually would have 2 to 3 staff members standing there with their special UV light to check people's stamps and then let them into the area. You cannot claim that the con was understaffed when you had 2 to 3 staff members at every checkpoint looking at this. Every other convention I've been to, the convention center staff checks people's badges and lets them into different areas. And there were convention center staff standing at those areas. It seems like a total...
really good point.
It's a total waste. And why couldn't they have reallocated some of those staff to handling the reg/pre-reg line on the first day? Like, I know that, I've never, I've planned events before. I've never planned a large-scale convention before, so maybe I am underestimating how difficult this kind of thing is when it comes to con ops. But there has to have been some flexibility with the staff that they had to address that problem. I feel that the staff was just not as well trained as they were. They, in most cases, they just were not allocated well, and it just blows my mind that it all worked out that way, at least the first day. I think that the con really needs to look at the way it uses its staff and hammer out some of their inefficiencies.
At least as far as the lineup queuing goes, absolutely correct about that. My experience from a panelist perspective, I was very impressed at the way that their staff were distributed for panelist management.
Oh yeah, that was great.
Yeah, so in each of the panelist rooms, they were equipped with door staff to check numbers. They had, each room had their own staff or volunteer manager who would be responsible for holding up cue cards, for making sure that the event ran smoothly, and most importantly, for liaising between panelists and the tech team to make sure that audio, video, and projector equipment were running smoothly and that computers were connecting correctly. They had music in between panels that was run. It was super well considered, given the logistics and time concerns that panels often have, especially if there are technological difficulties. I had a fantastic experience, actually, where I had brought in a Windows Surface Pro tablet to do my panel on the Friday, and I had a very specific kind of micro HDMI connection that was not a default type of adapter available for the projector connection.
For the record, I warned her on multiple occasions that bring your own adapter. Always bring your own adapter. Never assume that they'll have the adapter you need when you do a panel. And I spread the and I would like to bestow this advice onto my listeners as well, who I hope many of you may consider doing panels in the future as well.
Yes, Jesse's right, and you should listen to him, absolutely. I wanted to put a certain amount of faith in the Vancouver Convention Centre that as the most illustrious convention venue that the city had to offer, that they would have adapters available with their tech team, and I lucked out, and they did, and I was so fortunate. I actually went and talked to the information desk, and there was a fellow there who had his radio, and I said, can you get me an HDMI adapter that I can use for my tablet? And I showed him the picture, and I showed him exactly what I needed. And he got on the radio, and he called 3 or 4 different people, and he was so diligent finding the right people to talk to. He got in touch with the tech team. He coordinated a person to deliver the exact piece of equipment that I needed at that room on time. So I showed up when it was time for my panel. The adapter was already there. The tech person was there. We hooked it all up. It was the most. I've done 4 panels now for Anime Revolution, and it was the smoothest, most problem-free experience as a panelist I've ever had, and it is entirely thanks to the staff and their coordination.
Amanda, of course, did the Yuri panel. Girls Like Girls Yuri Revolution, and it was fantastic. You did a great job. I think it was one of the best panels of the weekend for sure.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I did 3 panels myself. They were Blatant Copyright Infringement in Anime, Quebec Anime Bizarro Wonderland, and Amazing Anime Deaths. And they were all, well, okay. As a panelist, my experience was overall very good. The lineups within the convention were all handled excellently. I thought the staff that attended to the various panel rooms were all, everything. There were no problems there at all, definitely. But even though the experience was good, and I feel that from an organizational standpoint, panels and programming was handled very well, the actual content of the convention, for the most part, was pretty subpar, to say the least. Anime Revolution, as I mentioned.
Let's talk about that. I want to talk about that. I think that's a really important point.
So, Anime Revolution, as I mentioned in the beginning, they put a huge amount of emphasis on stage performance stuff. They have their cosplay show, they have like the 70s anime dating show, they have the walk-off, which is like a big machismo competition that's a tradition that goes back to Anime Evolution. It's really weird, but remains an endearing favorite to this very day. They have all the stuff going on the stage constantly, and this stuff really doesn't appeal to me, but they do a good job of handling that stuff. But panels, remember how I said earlier that West Coast conventions tend to not have very good panels? Anime Revolution suffers from that problem greatly, and it suffers from an issue. Okay, it suffers of a few issues. The biggest one is the issue of Ask a Character panels. If you're not familiar with Ask a Character panels, they go by many names, but the ultimate premise is that you have, several people cosplaying as characters from a show. They roleplay they basically have the audience ask them questions, and they kind of they give these roleplay answers.
Answers, how they think the character would respond.
That's the important thing, how they think the character would respond. It very rarely coincides with how the character would actually respond in those cases. It usually just gives into, I would say, the worst excesses of fandom interpretation. A lot of the time.
Live action fan fiction.
Yeah, it is live action fan fiction. The problem with these panels is that they take very little effort to actually create. They're usually done by people who should be entering the cosplay contest and preparing skits, but they don't really want to put the effort into doing that, and would rather just run these kind of low effort panels because they get a cheap badge, sometimes even a free badge, and it just, it ultimately just, they're popular. These panels are always really popular, which is why they keep happening, but, they just give a free pass to people who are being lazy. It promotes and rewards laziness, and the positive response that they get just turns into a feedback loop. And then we just keep getting more and more of them every year. This year there were 3 for Yuri on Ice. It was ridiculous. And the funny thing is that, yes, they get a huge crowd, but one of those panels could have been about Sayo Yamamoto as an amazing female director. One could have been about how the series wonderfully adapts figure skating. Those panels would probably get a similar attendance to the low effort Ask a Character format.
Absolutely. So my general stance on this kind of thing is that if they're popular and people like to go to them, great. Make a craft room or a volunteer space where you can go to do your role-playing game the same way that you would have a gaming center where people can go and play werewolf.
Just make it one free-for-all room for that.
Yeah, or have a karaoke room or something like that you're doing that kind of thing, and that can be part of your convention experience. You sign up, have a great time, it's a lot of fun. Leave the panelist space and the panelist time for people who want to devote energy to more critical content or more a thoughtful analysis or portrayals of the anime that we love.
Yeah. I think it would be better is if they had a rule where if you're going to do a panel about a specific anime, you have to give some kind of lecture-style presentation that looks at the production, the storyline, the themes, or the broader fandom of a specific series, and actually analyzes and discusses it in a informative or creative way. And that would probably discourage most of the people who run these panels from doing them that way. I think that would be a simple solution. Now, I know that Anime Revolution, the last couple of years, was actually a lot better at trying to prevent panels like these from taking up a lot of space, but I was told, and I talked to the head programming director at Anime Revolution about this, and he told me that there was a shortage of content being submitted, and there weren't as many people submitting panels as usual, and I can believe that. I believe him when he says that, but I still think that the kind of situation where you have 3 Yuri on Ice Ask a Character panels is the type of situation where you should be proactively avoiding it. You should be, looking for people who are going to do better panels. There was no feminism in anime panel. Every convention has a feminism in anime panel. It is not difficult to find somebody in any urban area. It doesn't have to be like an activist kind of city. It can be any city. You'll find someone who can talk about feminism and anime for an hour.
I know. And you would consider Vancouver being the hotbed of social activism and having such a large anime fandom and anime community, an academic community. We've got 2 major universities here and a number of colleges. You would expect that there would be more of an interest or more of a demand for fans to talk about and have an outlet for these kinds of creative works and these kinds of creative panels. So where are the people? Where are the panelists?
There are people they can tap into, and they just kind of overlook it a lot of the time. Or it's just clearly not a priority. They don't prioritize this kind of content at all. It's pretty frustrating. It feeds into the fact that, our panels were pretty early in the day. There were less substantial panels that were getting emphasis in the prime hours. Like on Saturday, my Quebec panel, it was at 10 o'clock in the morning. The turnout was pretty low. It was like 50 or 60 people turned out for that, which is about what I expected for a panel about, anime in Quebec at 10 o'clock in the morning. And then my Anime Deaths panel was at 9:30 p.m. Good time slot for that panel for sure. But I had this huge gap in the middle of the day on Saturday, and there was literally nothing to do at the convention. They don't have like a manga library, or like you said, even something like a karaoke room or something you can just kind of drop into and have fun. They only have 2 screening rooms, which is, I think, the fewest I've ever seen in an anime convention. I don't think I've ever seen another con with fewer than 4.
I was also surprised at the size of the screening rooms, and I don't mean that in terms of the number of seats. I mean that in terms of the size of the screens.
They were very small rooms. And I mean, they had very small crowds, to be honest. And I think that's because they weren't really well planned. Those screening rooms were at the bottom of the priority list. And in previous years, they've screened movies in the main theater hall. They didn't do that this year. They actually didn't screen any actual anime content in the main events theater. It was all stage fandom based stuff. And I think that you saw a theme of actual anime content being downplayed in favor of just sort of fan content. And I think it's gone way too far in that direction. This is the problem you see at a lot of conventions, but I think that they're not really conscious of this problem at Anime Revolution. Most cons at least make some kind of effort to sort of, or at least major cons, make some kind of effort to sort of get more of a balance going. I didn't really feel there was any kind of effort for that at
I don't know if that's necessarily true, though, Jesse. If you look at the audience base coming to conventions and what a high percentage of, like you said, like those Ask a Character panels, those cosplay-related panels, they're the heavy hitters because so many cosplayers, in addition to being anime fans, but also who are there to learn about how to create warble armor in a certain way, what kind of makeup techniques should they be using to get the desired character effect. These are really popular, and the demand for them is growing, and I think part of the reason why Anime Revolution is growing as fast as it is because it is being very blatant about its willingness to include that kind of content, really trying to market itself as a cosplaying convention in addition to anime. And I agree with you, the anime is suffering for that, and there's a serious risk that it's going to knock its legs out from under itself. But I don't necessarily...
I would argue that kind of did happen this year, actually. And I disagree with any kind of positive spin you can give for Ask a Character panels. Those things are they are an actual serious organizational problem at conventions. I feel that more substantial panels could attract just as much a crowd and get people just as pumped up. But it's almost like putting effort into your panels being discouraged.
Because, yeah, I can agree with that.
So a number of problems here. The problem is that even from a sort of fundamental planning perspective, the panelists were treated well, the panels were handled well. I think that there needs to be more of a proactive effort to sort of encourage people to create better content and contribute better content, and give, a more variety of tastes, just something to occupy themselves with during the day, because there was nothing for me to do on Saturday. If there had been just two more, I won't get into like the choices of anime that were being screened, because when there's only two rooms, there's almost no point in picking that apart. Anything they throw on is going to seem arbitrary. They really should have had at least 2 or 3 more screening rooms. And if they do get another level of the anime of the convention center next year, that should be their priority, is getting more screening rooms going, more rooms that you can just kind of crash down in and just check out something that you've been meaning to see or haven't seen in a while or want to see again.
Absolutely, because as amazing an art form and a community as the cosplay community is, if you take away the substance that is driving this fan culture, at the expense of the fan, to just provide more space for fan culture, eventually you're going to run out of substance entirely, right? You need to continue to build on the media that is driving this community forward.
Yeah. And if you go to this convention, I urge you, if you listen to this show, like, please consider trying to, like, contribute your own or submit your own panel idea. Just do something. Do something to sort of achieve this balance, because, again, you can complain about the problems with Anime Revolution all the time, but it doesn't matter if people aren't actually making an active effort to make the convention better. And trying to submit more interesting panels is a great way of doing that. I highly encourage it.
And I think it's worth noting, Jesse, you don't need to be a professional to be a panelist. You don't need to be a renowned public speaker. You just need to be a fan and have something to say about anime.
This actually sort of brings me to another issue, and this is an issue that goes outside of this convention. It's another issue that taps into Vancouver as a very unique market for anime, which is something that I think that the various industries and related industries to anime should be paying attention to. We have this weird phenomenon, that only happens in Vancouver. As far as I know, this does not happen in any other city in North America, where we have a variety of amateur idol groups that basically dress up and do their own performances set to existing songs from series like, some specialize in Idolmaster, some specialize in Love Live, some specialize in the other versions of Love Live. I think usually they do pre-choreographed dances that already exist. I think some of them do their own as well. This started happening a few years ago. There was a group called Van 47 that started trying to get performance time at the various conventions going on in Vancouver. Now we have other groups like Natsu Heroes, there's Zeus, there's Decaloid, there's Boyish 7, Sigma, Shooting Star Idols, EPS Infinity. I have probably missed like 3 of them in this list, because every time I go back to try and check to see all the different amateur idol groups in Vancouver, I always discover one that I hadn't heard of before.
Yeah, remember how when we were kids it would be like, let's go to your buddy's garage and we'll start a band?
Yeah, it's let's start our own idol group. That's literally what's happening in Vancouver right now. These groups are all trying to build their own fan bases. They have their own followings. There is ridiculous drama going on between these groups that I understand is getting very intense and ridiculous, and I have to restrain myself from trying to keep up with it a lot of the time. It's so prominent as well. These groups appear at different events. They not even just anime events. They perform at various festivals and municipal events and across the different suburbs of Metro Vancouver. And it's just this really, really, really weird phenomenon that happens here and nowhere else. And I have a bit of a theory about that. As I mentioned, that Vancouver is this fertile market that is constantly ignored by the industry. And I think a lot of it ties into the large East Asian population. When you look at cities like, say, San Diego or San Francisco or Los Angeles, I think that the interest that exists for Asian idol culture in those cities is there are outlets for it. That industry kind of pays attention to those cities. There are events and promotions that happen there. Those sort of entities, those industry entities, they do not give a shit about Vancouver. They completely ignore Vancouver. Even though, it's I would argue, again, a much more fertile market, than they are, despite the lower population. This is sort of how they deal with it here. They just make their own groups and just sort of try to, recreate that idol fascination and obsession in the city and just kind of build it all from scratch, because the actual industry... It does feel
very Vancouver, doesn't it? That, it's got that grassroots feel that Anime Revolution still very much has in its undercurrent. It's definitely something I think that does help that convention stand apart from other conventions and is part of what makes it so interesting. It would be great to see a space continue to exist for these kinds of fan communities, but we definitely need to continue to develop more substance from the media side as well, and from the industry side.
I think that if the actual so-called idol industry complex were to try and have more of a presence in Vancouver, I think it could benefit these groups. They may get a higher profile, or it may expand into more interesting things. Who knows? I still don't really know how to feel about this whole amateur idol thing. It's such an interesting phenomenon that I can't be entirely negative about it. And I should point out that, again, these groups are at every anime event. They are constantly competing with each other for slots on stage time and things like that. And there's the idol showcase at Anime Revolution is a huge deal. But each of these groups, in their quest to, build their fan bases, they each kind of get their own panel, or at least several of them, the more popular ones, have their own panels at Anime Revolution. Which is so weird, because you see that, but you don't see, say you don't see any panels devoted to actual idol groups or actual idol culture in Japan and actually exploring that. You just see these amateur groups amassing their own followings, or using convention panels as a way of amassing their own followings. And
you really have to be careful about that, because there's certainly a risk of a bit of Japanese erasure happening there, and content erasure when you are focusing on the Western interpretation of that, or the Vancouver interpretation of that, at the expense of understanding the history and the context and all of the amazing things about idol culture that are inspiring these groups to exist at all.
Yeah, that's there. You could probably do 4 different panels just talking about different angles of this issue alone. That would probably attract huge crowds and be much more substantial than a lot of what we get at the convention.
There you go, listeners. If you were looking for an idea, there's your idea.
hell, a panel about the idol phenomenon in Vancouver would be more interesting than simply allowing the idol groups themselves to get all this panel space at the conventions, in my opinion. But yeah, that's just something that weirdly characterizes the fandom in Vancouver and the situation in Vancouver and the way things kind of get prioritized at an event like Anime Revolution. That said, I think they need to rein it in a little bit next year. These individual groups should not be getting their own panels. They should be, saving all their chips for the actual idol show. And again, I understand if there was a shortage of panel content, but there has to be some curation and vision in the way that the panel content is being treated. And I think that giving each of these groups their own panels is a very negative way of approaching it right now. I think we need a more challenging environment.
At the end of the day, that's exactly right. We need a greater demand for higher stakes. And if you continue to provide rewards and incentives like cheaper passes or freer passes, just at the base level of the content that you're producing, you're just going to go and be a character or be an idol group. And that's great, but eventually that's all you're going to have.
Yeah, and I mean by having their own panels, they get discounts on their badges. They almost become de facto guests at the convention. And I think that it's a really weird, bizarro kind of situation that we wind up with here as a result, where...
Yeah, and I don't want to demean any of these groups or the work that they do.
Yeah, for sure.
This is important to them, and it is the way of their space to express creativity, and all of that's fantastic, and they should have a space and a time to do that. but perhaps not in the same industry-sanctioned, incentivized way that is taking space away from more critical content.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're listening to this and don't know what we're talking about, I highly recommend reading into it a little more and reading about this whole thing going on in Vancouver, because it's really interesting and unique, and I don't really know what kind of direction it's going in. But it is worth following. But again, I don't think it's being treated in the necessarily the healthiest or most productive way right now. So on that note, and as I touched on earlier, actual industry presence was one of the biggest problems of this convention this year.
I think this is ultimately what this comes down to, yes.
Yeah. Anime Revolution has managed to have some degree of industry presence since they started. This is the first year they had nobody in. There was no Crunchyroll, no Aniplex. They had Pony Canyon USA there last year. I don't think they showed up to any panels or at any conventions this year, but they certainly weren't at Anime Revolution this time around. I don't entirely blame Anime Revolution for this. I do get the feeling that they in moving to the more expensive venue, accommodating industry was probably a sacrifice they decided to make. But this isn't just something isolated to Anime Revolution. I actually, as far as I could tell in the research that I did, the only industry panel that happened at any major anime convention in Canada this year was a single Funimation panel that took place at Otakuthon in Montreal. That's it. Nobody else had any kind of industry presence. And I know I've commented on the show before that industry panels tend to be really boring and predictable and don't really provide any real substance to people who follow these things even remotely. But I think it's still really important to have, just at least be able to say that you have an industry person at your convention, to have the presence of someone who will listen to fans even a little bit and give face time with fans. Because I've noticed that when these industry representatives come to Canada, like, people are just absolutely desperate to ask them questions and give them face time, which you see way less at the U.S. conventions, I've found. And I think it's just, even if it's symbolic importance, it's really important to try and just maintain that presence and tie. And I think that when you lose grip on the industry presence and actually keeping them coming every year, it just results in all this sort of, I don't want to say grassroots stuff to emerge as a result, but things just kind of fall apart when you have no industry, I find. I really do find that that's the case.
I think that's ultimately what this comes down to, this question of, like, we've got the space, we've got the fans, we're doing an excellent job on, and when I say we, I mean AniRevo is doing an excellent job on catering to fan content, providing space for fan content, but when we're talking about increasing the substance, the amount of quality, the caliber of the Japanese cultural experience, of the anime experience, the industry presence is really important for setting that precedent.
Yeah, like, even if it's a superficial presence to a degree, I think it is a symbolic presence that has a lot of impact and effect on the attendees and the way that they perceive the industry and the content and everything. And I think that, like, if the industry is not making an effort to come to Canada, and I feel that they are making less and less of an effort, because with the way we see things going with streaming, they seem to be becoming more concentrated, more focused than ever on the US, and just sort of treating Canada as a spillover market, hoping that whatever they throw out in the US will kind of wash up on enough of it will wash up on Canadian shores to keep people content. And I think that we need to push back against that mentality, and the conventions need to push back against the mentality, and they need to play a role in trying to keep those things together. And I think even when I mentioned with things like idols, I don't know what AR could do to try and engage the idol industry more. Like, I think that bringing in an actual idol group from Japan might be beyond them, at least this point. But I think there's more that they can do to actually get proper tie-ins and try and bring more attention from the industry towards Vancouver. Because I think as a major event and as a major brand and presence of the anime culture of Vancouver, they have kind of a responsibility to bring those eyes over here and let them see, what a fertile and needy market it kind of is.
And how much potential there is. I really do feel that Canadian conventions and Anime Revolution in particular have a distinct difference to them relative to SakuraCon and conventions in the US that really does come back to that grassroots core and that extreme fan community, because we're so underserviced, that extreme fandom that we see here does give us a different kind of experience. I love going to local cons. I love the enthusiasm and the excitement that you see in the people who come to Anime Revolution, the people who are here. They really want to be here. It's not just another photo shoot opportunity. And there's something really special about that. And I think, if industry presence were to gain on that marketability, they would recognize that there is something distinct about Vancouver, and that's worth their time.
Another big problem with the lack of industry is that things like bootlegs tend to get out of control when you don't have that sort of legitimate industry presence. One thing that has been happening with a lot of conventions across North America is that they have been separating their artist alleys and exhibitors hall. And the reason is because they're trying to because the thing is that you could make the argument that all fan art is copyright infringement, is bootleg, is illegal. We don't like to make that. We don't like to say that. We like to make a distinction and say this is fan art, this is allowed, this is good, this is positive, and say that the official merchandise, the stuff you buy in the exhibitors hall, this is different. It needs to be treated to a different standard, because you kind of get that murky middle sometimes of fan artists who make things that could very well be interpreted as bootleg merchandise, and that's why we're seeing more conventions trying to make that distinction. Anime Revolution is the complete opposite. I think a big reason for this is because they don't have access to as many exhibitors as other conventions do. And this was really bad last year because they actually were at the same time as Animethon in Edmonton, and that really hurt the presence of vendors at both of those conventions. But here, the lines between the Artist Alley and the Exhibitors Hall were blurred completely. The only distinction seemed to be how much money a certain kind of seller was willing to pay for a table. Because there were artists who were selling essentially bootleg merchandise out of more expensive vendor tables, in a lot of cases. And there were some vendors who were selling 100% bootleg merchandise. If you were at Anime Revolution and you bought anything at all from the pop-up shop, you bought a bootleg. That stuff was like some of the most blatant bootleg stuff I've ever seen. The pop-up shop in particular, they need to be banned from this convention. They should not be allowed to sell things at any convention ever. I saw some other sellers who tend to sell more legitimate merchandise at other events selling bootlegs at Anime Revolution. I'm pretty sure because they felt they could get away with it. I know that they're obviously, maybe a little desperate to get vendors a lot of the time, but they really need to crack down on this. They need to do something about it. They need to at least make it look like they care about creating that separation between what is Artist Alley, what is Dealers Hall, and having being very clear and articulate about what is acceptable and what is not in a Dealers Hall area. I think I've been harping on this, maybe not on the show, but certainly in feedback I've given the con for a few years, and they seem to fluctuate with how well they deal with it, but this has got to change for sure. I know that I think this is a problem with a lot of Canadian conventions as well, just because we don't have as many potential exhibitors here as American conventions do, and you got to have a big exhibitors hall when you have a convention, but what are you going to fill it with? Well, a lot of the time you just wind up filling it with bootlegs, unfortunately. And I think that this is something that conventions need to be more proactive in the way they deal with.
I do want to make a quick comparison here, also just again on this thought on fan communities and grassroots communities. I was, despite the amount of bootleg that was happening, quite surprised at the volume of fan-related content and artwork that was being provided and produced. Yeah. There were so many artists. I think the fan art vendors were probably double the size of what we saw at SakuraCon.
The Artist Alley area was, it was big. They had a lot of great stuff there for sure. I think that they should probably give more space to the Artist Alley, honestly, especially if they have trouble finding proper vendors. But they need to make that distinction. They shouldn't be using spillover from the artists to fill vendor space, because it just creates that gray area that lets the really bad bootleg sellers flourish.
Oh, it's so easy to camouflage in a space like that.
Exactly.
And given this idea of the fan culture and the grassroots culture that AniRevo is so good at, it sort of makes sense that you would want to showcase and highlight that to a certain extent. I'm quite confident that, though, just from what I saw on the floor on the weekend that I was there, that those fan artists and those fan booths were quite successful and very well frequented in the vendors hall.
The ones I talked to seem to be doing very well, and we're very happy with how things are going. I think it was overall a pretty good con for artists. It's also worth noting that they had a panel room going inside the exhibitors hall as well. I think it's because they were short on rooms and needed to fill space in the exhibitors hall. And to be perfectly honest, it wasn't anywhere near as bad as it probably sounds. The panel was easy to ignore. If anything, I think that being in the artist alley was probably more distracting to the panelists than it was to...
Easy to ignore is probably not good news for the panelists.
Yeah. It was a questionable decision. I hope that is one thing that they don't have to do next year. But yeah, I think...
Really, what should have done is use that space for the maid cafe.
Yeah, they had the maid cafe sort of upstairs sandwiched in... Did they have it in the room that had the good view, or was it sandwiched in between that room and the main theater? I actually didn't get close enough to notice. I think a wedding had the room with the nice view booked.
Yeah, no, I think they were sort of... I could have this confused with another area, but I think they were sort of on the main floor. Just off, towards the, sort of the, what do I want to say, not the south side, the west side of the convention, the opposite side from the panel halls, just kind of around the Starbucks area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and, it seemed like it was kind of a small space, but it, seems if you were going to generate that kind of traffic, having people go through the vendors hall to eat and back again would probably be a much better use of that space.
Yeah. Also, just going back to the vendors hall, there's a lot of stuff you could do to fill that space for sure. I think there's a lot of thinking that can go into that could arrive, or that could cause them to arrive at a better idea than let's put a panel room here. And here's another thing. I brought this up with you. I brought this up with I think a dozen people. Actually, I think I brought this up with everyone I talked to at the convention. Nobody knew what I was talking about. There was this weird smell in the dealer's hall. It almost made me nauseous on Friday, but every time I told people about the smell and how it made me feel, nobody knew what I was talking about. I seem to be the only person who noticed this, and it made me kind of worried because it made me think, am I having like some kind of unique reaction to something in this room that nobody else is? Maybe I need to see a doctor. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I am just crazy, but there was this weird smell in the dealer's hall. I thought it was due to the smoke, or had something to do with that. It made me think of all the smoke that was outside and the unpleasant conditions that created. Yeah, I had to mention that.
You're on your own for that one.
Yeah. I had to bring it up. It's just so weird. Yeah.
You know what? Because maybe you're not the only person. Maybe there's somebody out there listening who's going to say, yeah, it wasn't just burnt toast or...
If you smelled something weird at the Anime Revolution vendors hall, please email me and reassure me that I'm not alone here. Because I'm going to start questioning my sanity soon, unless someone backs me up on this. But yeah, if I'm the only person who noticed it, I guess I can't say that was a problem. So, good for everyone else, I guess. And then another thing is that this con can't seem to figure out what to do with gaming. They had like a console gaming area in the dealer's hall, and then upstairs they had this sort of, it was what seemed to be an attempt at like a DDR kind of quasi arcade gaming room that was just unbelievably pathetic. The idea was nice. That seemed to be a good spot to try and put some accessible gaming, but they gotta put actual effort into it. They just had like these tiny TV screens and a couple DDR games going. Come on, guys, try a little harder in that area. Maybe consolidate the gaming together, get something a little more cohesive going.
Maybe if I'm wrong, but didn't they at one point convert one of the screening rooms into a gaming room?
They did, and that's another thing I have a problem with, is that they put so little emphasis on the actual screening of anime that they actually closed the screening rooms down at 11 and turned them into gaming rooms, which I'm willing to bet very few people went to. I didn't actually investigate, but I think that it does show a questionable sense of priority. They really need to put more emphasis on actually screening anime, like they really do. They should be able to just put all the gaming in one place. Like having the gaming move around like that is kind of crazy.
I think they need to put more of an emphasis on anime in general. And when I say that, I mean anime screening. I mean industry presence. I mean, an emphasis on panels that deal with the content of anime. There's an undercurrent theme here.
Well, maybe let's go to the one thing they did succeed wildly at, and that is the presence of Japanese voice actors.
Yes.
In fact, probably the biggest draw of Anime Revolution is that they managed to get really great seiyuu guests every year. They actually got 4 this year, which I think might actually be a record for a Canadian convention. I don't usually Anime North and the like, they manage to get 1 or 2 at the most. But 4, I don't think I've ever seen a Canadian con get 4 seiyuu all in one go before.
Major props, AniRevo.
Yeah.
Major.
Yeah, they got 4. They got Kanu Ueda. She is the voice actress of Rin in Fate Stay Night, and all of her panels were impossible to get into. She seemed to be the most popular guest for sure. They also got Emery Kato, who is she's the voice of Kyubey from Madoka. And Katsuyuki Konishi, who I was kind of excited about because he's the voice actor of Kamina from Gurren Lagann. I went to his panel. It was a bit of a letdown. The thing about voice actor Q&A panels is that they're usually not very interesting. You get everything filtered through a translator, and they tend to fall back on kind of canned PR answers to a lot of questions, and usually a lot of people in the audience just ask really bad questions anyway. You don't get a lot of interesting things going on. And there was a lot of that. When I was leaving, or before I left, I made a last-minute decision to pop in on Shizuka Ito's panel. She's done a lot of roles. She was Himawari in the Triple X Holic anime. She is perhaps more notable as Akino in High School DxD and Liliana in Queen's Blade. In fact, I think that she has popped up in just about every titty anime that has come out over the last 4 or 5 years.
Like the roster.
Yeah. So my other con buddy who I was hanging out with during the weekend, David, he said that we should go to the Q&A, so I dropped in because I didn't really have anything else to do. And I gotta say that panel was a blast. It was she didn't really give canned responses. She was kind of going off the wall with perverted answers. She was for a good portion of the panel, she was just talking about other voice actresses' breasts. And it was really funny. I'm really glad I popped in on that panel. It was a lot of fun, and it sort of went against what I usually expect from Japanese seiyuu panels. But another thing I gotta give them props for, and this is something that Anime Revolution has done every year, is that they don't just have Q&A panels with their voice actors. They actually do a live voice actor recording. They play an episode of an anime with the sound muted, and they actually get the voice actors to perform as the characters. And I think someone at Anime Revolution must know Takashi Takadera. He's a voice director from Japan. He has come to the convention, I think, the last 4 years, and he has hosted these live voice actor recordings. And he actually coaches the voice actors as they're doing the episodes, and they do different takes. And, obviously it's... Actually, I don't feel it's really staged at all. It does feel like a pretty earnest effort to recreate a seiyuu recording session. And it really is a joy to watch. It's a really great concept, and I am glad that they do that. And it's one of the highlights of the convention for sure. It was definitely the highlight of my Saturday at the convention. Granted, I do think they need to start branching out a little bit. I know obviously they must have connections at a talent agency in Japan, which is why they keep bringing in so many voice actors. It'd be great if they brought in, a director or a mangaka or a storyboard artist. Or something like that. Someone who works in another aspect of anime.
Production side.
Yeah. Exactly. I still think the best kind of panel is when you have an artist and give him a tablet and a projector and just let him draw and maybe answer questions while doing it, because you get to actually see him in the live creative process. Or him or her, I should say. Sorry. I think that is the best kind of content you can get at an anime convention most of the time. And I think Anime Revolution, I know that, again, getting these voice actors is part of their successful formula they don't want to break out of. But I think they need to get out of that comfort zone a little bit and try and get different types of guests. They are ready for that, for sure. And I'd love to see them branch out.
They're building that momentum. They're growing. They've got the fan base. They've got the convention space. Now it's time to ramp up the quality.
Or most importantly, just get out of the comfort zone. Just try different things. Because, and I think this is a criticism that goes back to the fact that they are a for-profit convention. As long as they can keep kind of exploiting the successful formula and still being the only game in town that can tap into those few key things that allow an anime convention to gain momentum, they don't have a lot of incentive to break away from that. And I think that people really need to get on their case about it more and request more diversity from the con. Because it would just, it'd make it a better event overall in every way, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to kind of round it out. Mm-hmm. I thought there were, like you said, it was okay. Some things they do really, really well. In particular, the inclusion of voice actors, and and in that fan culture and the grassroots culture are all done really well.
So I guess the big question is, the con for the full weekend costs $75. I hear people calling this con expensive, and I actually don't agree. I think that for $75 Canadian, it is worth the price of admission, and I think that people who complain about that cost are kind of out of touch with how much most conventions actually cost. What do you think, Amanda? What do you think that it's worth the price of admission?
I would say, especially given the value of Canadian currency right now, that if you were trying to go to a convention in the States, or if you're from the States and trying to go to a convention in Canada, either way, you're winning.
Yeah, I would say that if you live in Metro Vancouver, despite all of the issues that we've talked about, I think Anime Revolution is definitely worth going to. For better or worse, I honestly think it is the best convention in the city. Some may argue that Fan Expo Vancouver is better. I am personally not a fan of Fan Expo at all. I think that Anime Revolution, it taps into my interests a little better than that one does. But yeah, if you live in Metro Vancouver, I think it is absolutely worth coming to. If you are driving distance from Metro Vancouver, I would say come, don't get your expectations too high, but if you're coming from like Washington or something, you can enjoy the low dollar, at least, and try some good food, while you're up here as well. I will say, as much as I am waiting for this convention to become good enough that I can recommend people to fly to Vancouver for it, but I can't. It is not good enough to justify flying to Vancouver, in my opinion. Unless next year they get a guest or a performer that you absolutely must see.
I do want to make one small caveat to that, and that is if you are a rural Canadian living in British Columbia or in a neighboring province, keeping in mind that AniRevo is the third largest convention that we have in Canada and is probably the largest on the west side of Canada. If you're going to go to any convention this year, and you need to put out the money to do it because you live really far away, this is probably the one you're going to do it for.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I guess when I say driving distance, I should expand that to people who live in like the more eastern or northern parts of British Columbia as well. And
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we had a lot to say about that con for sure. Did you have any other final thoughts you wanted to share, Amanda?
Well, I think ultimately what I'd like to say is that as a local con, I love being able to go to local cons. There's something really awesome about the fact that my city is doing something so big that I can go and have a great time at the weekend and go home and sleep in my own bed at night. You can't replace that experience. Local cons are great, and if you want to continue to have great local cons, it's really important that you go to them and that you contribute to them. Again, going back to this idea that if you've got an idea or you're passionate about a particular part of Japanese culture or Japanese anime, like get out there, make your voice heard, because that's so important for keeping that momentum going. I was really impressed at the turnout and the enthusiasm of the people who came, given that we were basically smoked out the entire weekend. You could not see across the bay to North Vancouver. The view of the convention center, which should have been spectacular, was mostly just gray haze, and yet despite air quality concerns, which, some people had been saying on the news was comparable to Beijing in terms of air pollution, despite all of these setbacks, people were lining up for hours, longer than they should have been, but they were there. That's really quite a spectacular feat in terms of fan commitment, in terms of the love of the genre, in terms of the love of the media, and it's such a beautiful thing to see in this city. I really want to see that continue to grow.
Anime Revolution, I think there's as we have demonstrated, there's a lot to talk about with this convention. I think it's one to keep an eye on. I'll be there next year in all likelihood, for sure, doing more panels, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes moving forward, for sure.
I can't wait to see what the next few years have in store. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today and to participate in in your podcast, Jesse.
No problem, Amanda. Thanks so much. Thanks to everyone listening for tuning into Zonen Canada. You can reach me on Twitter at Zonen Canada or email zonencanada@gmail.com. Amanda, where can people find you on online or social media?
Well, I keep a low profile on the internet, so please just contact Jesse, and if you'd like to hear from me, then I will go through him.
Okay, fair enough. The theme song is by Ultraclystron. You can find it on his album Packet Flood, which can be purchased at ultraclystron.com. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play Music, or your podcast app of choice, and leave a rating or review if you have a chance. I'd really appreciate it. If you know anyone who might like this show, please recommend it to them. See you again.
Bye.